you've become engaged in a very public spat with the Secretary of Defense over the Navy's budget. Why this fight now? From your standpoint, obviously you have priorities which you feel are important from the service. On the Secretary's part, his issue is there's a Budget Control Act that's still law, and that caps funding overall. Why this fight, and why this fight now, especially in the twilight of the administration, where in another month everybody's going to have a new job?
Well, that's exactly my question. This budget that we're preparing is purely symbolic. I mean, any new administration, doesn't matter how the election came out, any new administration is going to put in their own budget. Congress has already passed a continuing resolution. They're not even going to get to the 17 budget, much less the 18 budgets, which is what we're talking about. So why say we need a smaller Navy? Nobody thinks we need a smaller Navy. Why not put in a budget that says, here's the Navy we need? What's being done now is a budget-driven strategy. What Congress has been asking for in every time I've gone and testified is a strategy-driven budget. And so the budget that I'm willing to put in, and the budget that I think we should put in, is if you want the Navy to do the job that the nation needs, here's what we need. You talked about the next administration's talked about getting rid of the BCA and talking about that. You put in a budget, but you put in a budget about what you need to do the job. The other thing is, this administration, this president, this administration has dramatically built the Navy. It's going to be far larger because of ships we put under contract during the last 7.5 years. Why undercut that message? Why say, no, we don't need that? No, we don't need a Navy like that. Because we do. And the other thing I think if you want to talk about just pure money, if you cut ships, you're not going to save any money. In fact, it'll probably cost you more. If you cut a submarine, we got a free submarine. You'll get 9 instead of 10 for exactly the same amount of money, maybe a little bit more. If you cut destroyers, you will get fewer destroyers for more money. If you cut littoral combat ships, you will get fewer for more money. So even if you're doing it purely on financial reasons, this is not the way to do it. If you cut a ship, you will not save a penny. In fact, you will end up spending more, because the way you save money on ships is you build, Congress approves a multi-year, which they've been doing with great regularity, or a block buy. You give the shipyards certainty as to how many you're going to buy. They make the infrastructure investments. They hire the people. They do all the training. You keep the technology stable. You keep the designs the same. And the price per ship comes down. And it's come down dramatically on every single type ship. You start cutting in the future, and the savings go away.
What does that $17 billion include? What else is in that amount of money? Because obviously you had your shipbuilding plan covered before you asked for that much more money.
Well, again, I think we're going to come out with the force structure assessment, with the Navy's force structure assessment, and as you said, the fleet architecture study pretty soon here. And what I think this budget that we put in, which again is purely symbolic, the chances of it getting enacted in any sort of current form, about the same as me flying to the moon tomorrow. It's just not going to happen. And so what I see this budget is a bridge between what we're doing now to get to 308 and what we need to do to get to whatever the higher number force structure assessment is going to be.
Could it be around 350?
I'm not going to talk about numbers, but it will be clearly substantially more than 308.
Do you think you're going to get the money? Because from Dr. Carter's standpoint, this is the cap, this is what we have to live under, and we have to submit a budget within the cap, including what OMB has sent us.
Well, again, from my standpoint, this is a meaningless budget in terms of, except symbolically. And I think we ought to put in a budget for, here's what we need. Here's the Navy that we need. Here's, if you want the Navy to continue to do the job, and, you know, not just in terms of numbers, not just in terms of number of ships, not just in terms of number of aircraft, but also in capabilities, readiness. You know, putting in a budget under BCA controls just kills us in terms of readiness.
Have you taken the case to the White House?
I'm not going to get into the inside baseball stuff here, but
some of us are interested in the
well,
inside baseball.
you know, you read the last line of my memo. I said, you know, it's clearly in the Secretary of Defense's power to put in whatever budget for the department he wants to, but I won't, and I will dissent very, very publicly.
I think you've made that abundantly clear. I want to take you to Goldwater-Nichols reforms. You are now the third longest-serving Secretary of the Navy. The job has changed dramatically. I mean, obviously, then there was a War Secretary and a Secretary of the Navy. Obviously, in 1947, we had a Defense Department, completely different structure with the Secretary of Defense, et cetera. And these Goldwater-Nichols reforms are looking to shift some authority back to the services. If you were advising, or you have advice, as this process continues with Senator McCain and Mac Thornberry, but also their deputies, Jack Reed, or the ranking members, Jack Reed and Adam Smith, what would you tell them? Does the Secretary of the Navy need more power and more authority than they have now?
Well, here's what I've been saying publicly for a while.
You can also say what you've been saying privately for a while.
I mean, I've been saying the same thing publicly and privately. It's not a surprise what I've been saying. A lot of the money we spend in the Pentagon, at least $1 out of every 5, and it may be more than that, doesn't go to the services. So it doesn't go to the warfighter. It goes to the Pentagon writ large. It goes to
the Fourth Estate.
The Fourth Estate. And most of that, to me, is just pure overhead. It not only doesn't help the warfighter, it takes money away from our warfighting capabilities. I'll give you a quick example. DFAS, Defense Finance and Accounting Service. They write our checks. That's the main thing they do. Their money is appropriated to us, so we send the money to them. We send the information to them because we've got an accounting service and a financial management service ourselves. We send all that information to them. Last year, we paid them $300 million just to write our checks. And we're probably not going to get a clean audit in the Department of the Navy because 9 out of 10 of DFAS's internal controls don't work. Now, you know, it sort of defies logic that we would do that. What's that $300 million go for? And remember when people used to balance checkbooks, and if you couldn't find that last $1.17 after going back through, you just make a correcting entry, $1.17. DFAS does that every month, sometimes $1 billion. They just can't tell you where it went. We've got the services each have their own accounting system. They each have their own financial system. Why do we need that layer on top? Why do we need that overhead to do that? And I think there's a lot of money that can be saved there. So in terms of, I think that responsibility and authority ought to go together. And I'll give you one other example. When a ship is over budget, I'm the one they ought to hold accountable. I'm the one that, and they do. I mean, Congress does, and they should. That's my responsibility. In a joint program like the Joint Strike Fighter, I have no control over that. I mean, we're buying Joint Strike Fighters for the Navy and the Marine Corps. program's way behind schedule, it's way over budget, but who's accountable? Who's accountable for that? It ought to be the service secretary and the service chief that's accountable for these things. You ought to be able to point to somebody and say, you're accountable. And you can't do that in these joint programs. Same thing, healthcare. One of the things that about 5 years ago, the National Capital Region, all the hospitals here were taken out from under the services. So Bethesda out from under Navy, Walter Reed out from under Army, and Belvoir out from under Army, Andrews out from under the Air Force, and put in the Defense Health Agency. Well, you look today, I mean, we objected to that, but you look today and it's the highest cost per patient in the whole system and the lowest patient satisfaction in the whole system because nobody's accountable. A Secretary of the Army and a Chief of Staff of the Army got fired for conditions at Walter Reed. Who do you fire today if you find something like that? There's nobody you can hold accountable because...
Well, the head of the Defense Health Agency, right? Presumably.
All right, who is that? You don't know.
Well, like
nobody knows. I mean, it's sort of a...
They're not as prominent of a person, but right.
And also, you can't... It's not as...
I mean, you could fire Dr. Woodson if you wanted to in you know...
I suppose you could, but would it make the same impact as it did with Walter Reed? And it really is hard to find accountability when you don't have, when it's not service related. And our services approach healthcare, for example, in very different ways. And it's part of our readiness. I mean, we train our corpsmen, or the Army medics, train theirs as part of this healthcare system for their next deployment. If you have it run under the Defense Health Agency, it's unclear if you're going to be ready for that next deployment. So all I'm saying is I've been in government a long time in a lot of different roles. I mean, I was a governor. I was a state auditor before that. I've been an ambassador. And one of the things that I found is that when you try to combine things, and this is such a big organization. I mean, each one of our services is huge. When you try to combine functions, it's always with the goal of saving money. It's always with the goal of fewer people. It's always with the goal of economies of scale. And I've never once seen that work. It always adds people. It always adds a layer of just one more layer of bureaucracy, one more layer of money that you've got to spend. And in this case, I mean, that $300 million that we're paying to DFAS,
that's 2/3 of a littoral combat ship from your standpoint.
Yeah. And that money does not help the warfighter, does not help a sailor, does not help a Marine, doesn't help a soldier, doesn't help an airman in any way, shape, or form. And so, yes, you ought to move responsibility, a lot of responsibility, back to the services, but you also ought to move accountability back to the services. I mean, if something's not working, it ought to be me, it ought to be the Chief of Naval Operations, it ought to be the Commandant of the Marine Corps who is held accountable.
But how do you respond to the criticism then that we were in a very bad place before Goldwater-Nichols, and if left to their own devices, the services would get back to their chicanery of, you know, not coordinating things, not being as joint, having their own independent programs without any, you know, the F-35 was a program that's been brought back on the rails. Dr. Carter spent a lot of time doing it. You know, Bob Wirt, Frank Kendall have done, you know, a huge job focusing on getting that back on track because of the original sins, the way that that program was born.
Well, I think when Goldwater-Nichols was enacted, it did address a lot of issues that we had and that were in this building and around things. That's been 35 years ago. We are now a joint force. I mean, it's in our DNA. We don't approach things separately. I mean, we work very closely together. But I do think the pendulum swung way too far the other way. And again, it's this overhead, it's this bureaucracy. I mean, if you've got oversight, if that's the goal, then that's one thing. And you ought to have oversight. You ought to have people keeping folks honest. You ought to, I mean, I'll put what we've done in Navy and Marine Corps up against anybody in terms of driving down cost, in terms of keeping programs in line, and this thing. But you talked about, I mean, the JSF. I mean, even Frank Kendall has said this is the last big program that ought to be a joint program.
Well, a joint program structured the way that it was originally, and some of the problems with concurrent development and
yeah, but you look at those 3 aircraft. I mean, the Air Force has got one, the Marine Corps has got one, the Navy's got one. They're only 40% common parts. These are 3 very different aircraft. I mean, the Marines is a vertical takeoff and landing.
Yeah.
The Air Force has a gun. The Navy has to have a much heavier suspension, tailed hook for carrier operations.
And the Navy had a bigger bomb requirement, so it carries larger weapons.
And so, you know, it's not really a joint program. It's 3 different programs, but it's being run as a joint program. And yeah, it got back sort of on the rails, but why did it go off the rails in the first place?
I think we could devote another program entirely to that.
But that's my argument, that get rid of some of this extra layer that's laid over the services. Goldwater-Nichols in terms of making sure that things are done jointly, making sure there's not duplication, making sure that everybody's working together, that the, you know, for example, the Marine Corps and the Army aren't developing 2 different small arms or 2 different rifles or something like that. That sort of oversight, but not the, okay, you've got to jump through this hoop and that hoop and this other hoop after you've made that decision.
But the counterpoint to that would be looking, you know, a Navy friend of mine was saying this, you know, it's not like somebody else contributed to the problems we had with the LCS, the problems we had and the challenges we had with Zumwalt, that was, you know, or the future combat systems in the case of the Army. You know, the services themselves propone programs that may be problematic. They too take a long time. I mean, I think it's safe to say that the U.S. military could make anything work. There's no doubt that the LCS will work. But the question that some folks have said is, you know, the Navy got itself into its own pickle on that thing and has sort of been working to work its way out of it, right? It's not like it was Frank Kendall's fault or OSD's in that case.
Well, I mean, the quote I used one time was, that bed was already on fire when I got in it. And yes, I mean, if you want to, you know, I know that a couple of senators said who to hold accountable for the Ford carrier. Well, call back Don Rumsfeld. You know, it was decisions made a long time ago, but I think you can structure things so that you do have oversight, so that you don't have programs that get into that sort of trouble. But I carry I have to testimony a chart that shows everything you've got to go through for a program of record, and it looks like a plate of spaghetti. I mean, it's no wonder these things cost so much money. It's no wonder it takes a long time. And one of the things we've been doing is bypassing a lot of this through demonstrations. I mean, one of the things you ought to do is either succeed fast or fail fast. You know, find out, is this going to work or is it not going to work? One of the ways to do that is send it out to the fleet. If it's not going to work, then kill it. But if it is going to work, or it needs some tweaking, or it needs some modifications, let's figure that out. But let's figure that out early, before you get into this long, drawn out. I mean, the railgun is a good example. The railgun became a program of record in the 1980s. We still don't have one on a ship today. The science is probably there, but just fighting through the myriad bureaucracies that you have to do has slowed down that and a lot of other programs. you got to have oversight. It's one of Congress's big jobs. It's one of, under Goldwater-Nichols and under anything, it ought to be one of OSD's big jobs. But oversight is different from micromanagement. And oversight is different from overhead. And today, I mean, when you're spending, if you were in business and you're spending $1 out of every 5 on something that doesn't go to your core competencies, that's just overhead, you wouldn't last long.